to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. In the vast prairies of 1870s Kansas, a humble family-run inn along the Osage Mission Trail seemed to offer weary travelers a safe haven from their long journeys. The Benders, a father, mother, and their 2 adult children, appeared to be simple shopkeepers trying to make an honest living. But behind their canvas curtain lurked a sinister secret. With a hammer, a trap door, and a carefully orchestrated seating arrangement, they turned their quaint establishment into one of America's first documented houses of horror. At least 11 travelers who stopped for a warm meal never left the property alive, their bodies buried in the family's apple orchard. And when the law finally came knocking, the bloody Benders vanished into thin air, sparking one of the largest manhunts in frontier history. Tonight, we'll uncover the terrifying truth behind America's first family of serial killers. The windswept prairies of southeastern Kansas in the early 1870s were a place of both promise and peril. As settlers and travelers made their way through Labette County, following dreams of prosperity in the American West, few could have imagined the horror that awaited some of them at an innocuous little cabin along the Osage Mission Trail. The Bender family appeared in Labette County sometime in 1870, settling on a 160-acre piece of land near the small community of Cherryvale. They were unremarkable at first glance. John Bender Sr., a man in his 60s with a thick German accent, his wife Mary, who spoke so little English she was often assumed to be mute, and their 2 children, John Jr. and Kate. Kate, in particular, would become a figure of local intrigue, beautiful, outspoken, and claiming to possess spiritual healing powers. The Benders constructed a small cabin that served dual purposes, their home and a grocery store with an attached inn for weary travelers. The building was simple, divided by a canvas curtain that separated the store from the family's living quarters. This curtain would later prove to be an integral part of their murderous scheme. In those days, it was common for travelers to seek refuge at such establishments. The prairie could be an unforgiving place, and the promise of a warm meal and safe shelter was often irresistible to those making their way across the territory. The Benders seemed to offer exactly that, a humble but welcoming stop for the weary traveler. What made their location particularly attractive was its position along the Osage Mission Trail, a major travel route that connected Fort Scott with Independence and the Indian Territory. Wealthy travelers often passed through, carrying substantial amounts of money or valuable goods. The Benders' store, sitting approximately 50 miles north of the Oklahoma border, was perfectly positioned to attract such visitors. The family quickly established themselves in the community. John Sr. and his wife kept to themselves mostly, but Kate became known throughout the region for her involvement in spiritualism. She held seances, claimed to heal the sick, and even gave public lectures on spiritualism in nearby towns. This public persona helped establish a level of credibility and trust within the community that would serve their sinister purposes well. The first disappearances began sometime in 1871. The pattern was subtle at first. Travelers who were expected to pass through the area simply never arrived at their destinations. In the vast expanse of the frontier, such disappearances weren't entirely unusual. The prairie could be dangerous, with natural hazards, wild animals, and the occasional bandit making travel risky. But as 1872 progressed, the number of disappearances began to mount. George Launcher and his infant daughter left Independence headed for Iowa, never to be seen again. George Brown vanished after leaving Fort Scott for Iowa. William York, a prominent doctor from Independence, disappeared while searching for the missing Launcher and his child. The Benders' method was as efficient as it was brutal. When a wealthy-looking traveler would stop at their store, they would invite them to dinner. The guest would be seated at the table with their back to the canvas curtain, the place of honor, as the Benders would insist. Behind that curtain, one of the male benders would wait with a hammer. During the meal, while the guest was distracted by conversation or Kate's flirtations, the killer would emerge from behind the curtain and strike the victim in the back of the head with the hammer. The body would then be dropped through a trapdoor into the cellar below, where the victim's throat would be cut to ensure death. Later, under the cover of darkness, the family would bury the body in their apple orchard. The benders were careful in selecting their victims. They targeted travelers who appeared to be carrying money or valuable goods, and who were unlikely to be missed immediately. They also kept detailed records of their victims' possessions, which were later discovered among their belongings. The scheme might have continued indefinitely if not for the disappearance of Dr. William York. Unlike their other victims, York was a prominent citizen whose brother was Colonel Ed York, a well-known and influential figure in the area. When Dr. York vanished, his brother launched an extensive search that would eventually lead to the bender's doorstep. As winter turned to spring in 1873, suspicion began to mount. The number of disappearances had become too numerous to ignore, and locals began to whisper about the strange family that kept to themselves but always seemed to have money despite their modest store. The community called a meeting to discuss the missing persons, and interestingly, the benders attended, sitting quietly among their neighbors while plans were made to search every homestead in the area. It was this meeting that likely sealed their fate, but not in the way the townspeople intended. Shortly after the meeting, the benders fled in the night, leaving behind their store, their livestock, and most importantly, the evidence of their horrific crimes. When neighbors finally noticed their absence and investigated the property, they discovered a scene that would shock the nation and earn the benders their place in criminal history. As Colonel York and a group of armed men approached the Bender property in late April 1873, the first sign that something was amiss was the abandoned livestock. Cattle and horses wandered the property, clearly unfed for days. The cabin stood silent, its windows dark and dusty. Inside, they found the store's goods still on the shelves, but the family's personal belongings were gone. The investigation quickly focused on the cabin's dirt floor, particularly in the family's living quarters. A peculiar odor emanating from the cellar drew their attention. When they lifted the trapdoor, the horror of the benders' crimes began to reveal itself. The cellar floor was saturated with blood, so much that it had pooled and congealed in the dirt. The walls bore dark splatter patterns that told tales of unimaginable violence. But it was in the apple orchard where the full extent of the benders' brutality would be discovered. As spring rains had softened the earth, suspicious depressions had appeared among the trees. Township trustee George Leroy directed men to begin digging, and soon the first body was unearthed. Over the following days, more victims were discovered, buried in various states of decomposition. Dr. York's body was among the first found, buried face down with a crushed skull and a slashed throat. Nearby lay George Launcher and his 8-month-old daughter, the infant still cradled in her father's arms. William Boyle's body was identified by his distinctive boots. As the dig continued, more victims emerged: Henry Mackenzie, Johnny Boyle, Benjamin Brown, and others whose names would never be known. In total, 11 bodies were discovered on the property, though many historians believe the actual number of victims could be significantly higher. Some bodies showed signs of being stripped of valuables: wedding rings twisted from fingers, pockets turned inside out, and valuable personal effects missing. The benders hadn't just been killers, they had been methodical robbers. The discovery sparked a media sensation. Newspapers across the country carried lurid details of the bloody benders and their house of horrors. Thousands of curiosity seekers descended on the property, taking pieces of the cabin as souvenirs until virtually nothing remained. The hammer used in the killings, found in the abandoned house, was put on display in a local museum where it drew crowds of morbidly fascinated visitors. But where were the Benders? The manhunt that followed would become one of the largest in frontier history. Colonel York offered a $1,000 reward for their capture, equivalent to over $20,000 today. Vigilante groups formed across Kansas, each determined to bring the killers to justice. Reports of Bender sightings flooded in from across the country. The investigation revealed that the family had fled in two groups. John Sr. and his wife were traced to a railway station in Thayer, Kansas, where they had purchased tickets headed south. John Jr. and Kate had taken a different train to Kansas City and then seemingly vanished into the growing American West. The truth about the Benders' relationships also began to emerge. It turned out that John Jr. and Kate weren't actually siblings, but rather a couple, possibly common law husband and wife. Kate's real name was believed to be Almira Make, and she had previously been married to a man in Illinois. Even more surprising, evidence suggested that Ma Bender might not have been John Sr.'s wife at all, but rather a woman named Sarah Eliza Davis with a criminal history of her own. Theories about their fate multiplied as the years passed. Some claimed the family had escaped to Mexico, while others insisted they had returned to Germany. A persistent story suggested they had joined a group of outlaws in Texas. In 1889, 2 women were arrested in Michigan on suspicion of being Ma and Kate Bender, but they were eventually released when their identities couldn't be conclusively proven. One of the most intriguing theories came from a man named James Griffith, who claimed in 1908 that he had been part of a vigilante group that caught up with the Benders near the Texas border. According to Griffith, the vigilantes had executed the family and buried them in unmarked graves. While his story contained convincing details, like many other claims about the Benders' fate, it could never be verified. The case took another turn when Laura Buckskin, a Native American woman, came forward with a shocking claim. She said she had seen Kate Bender years after the murders, living among a group of Indians in southern Oklahoma Territory. According to Buckskin, Kate had married a small-time criminal and had 3 children before dying of apoplexy in 1890. However, like so many other leads, this one also led nowhere definitive. Another theory suggested that the Benders had fallen victim to vigilante justice closer to home. Some believed that local men, enraged by the discoveries at the Bender property, had tracked the family down and enacted frontier justice, keeping their actions secret to protect themselves from legal consequences. This theory gained credence when several prominent local men refused to discuss the Benders' disappearance, even decades later. The refusal of certain prominent citizens to discuss the Benders' fate has led many historians to believe they knew more than they were willing to share. In particular, the actions of Colonel York himself came under later scrutiny. As a man of considerable influence and means, with a personal stake in avenging his brother's murder, he had both the resources and motivation to pursue private justice. The investigation into the Benders' crimes continued to reveal disturbing details about their operation long after their disappearance. Among their abandoned possessions, investigators found a book containing detailed records of their victims' belongings. The methodical nature of these records suggested that the murders were far from crimes of opportunity. They were a calculated business enterprise. Kate Bender's role in the killings became a particular focus of public fascination. While the male Benders were believed to have delivered the fatal hammer blows, evidence suggested that Kate was the true architect of their scheme. Her public persona as a spiritualist and healer had served as the perfect cover, drawing in victims with promises of seances and healing sessions. She would often flirt with male travelers, convincing them to stay for dinner, a fatal decision that would lead them to the seat of honor facing the canvas curtain. Letters found in the cabin revealed that Kate had regularly corresponded with other spiritualists and self-proclaimed psychics across the country. Some theorized that these connections might have helped the family establish new identities after their escape. The spiritualist movement of the 1870s was a close-knit community, and its members were known to protect their own. The Bender case had lasting effects on the development of law enforcement in the American frontier. The difficulties in coordinating the manhunt across multiple jurisdictions highlighted the need for better communication between law enforcement agencies. The case also demonstrated the limitations of frontier justice systems, where the lack of organized police forces made it difficult to track criminals who crossed state or territorial lines. The story of the Benders became deeply embedded in Kansas folklore. Local legends arose about the property being cursed, with farmers refusing to plant crops in the field where the bodies were found. Stories circulated about ghost sightings near the old cabin site, with witnesses claiming to hear screams on quiet nights or see apparitions of the victims wandering among the trees. In the decades that followed, various artifacts from the Bender case surfaced in unexpected places. In 1961, a hammer believed to be the murder weapon was donated to the Kansas Museum of History. DNA testing wasn't available in the 19th century, but modern analysis of the hammer revealed traces of blood, lending credence to its authenticity. The case also had a profound impact on how Americans viewed the danger of strangers in their midst. The Benders had appeared to be a normal immigrant family, trying to make their way in the new world, yet they had perpetrated some of the most horrific crimes in frontier history. Their story became a cautionary tale about the dark possibilities lurking behind seemingly normal facades. In 1937, an elderly woman on her deathbed in Michigan claimed to be Kate Bender. She provided detailed information about the murders that hadn't been publicly known, but she died before her story could be verified. Similar deathbed confessions would surface periodically throughout the 20th century, each adding new layers to the mystery, but never providing definitive answers. The Bender case also influenced popular culture in unexpected ways. Their story became one of the first widely publicized serial killer cases in American history, predating better-known cases like H.H. Holmes by several decades. The image of the seemingly peaceful prairie homestead concealing horrific secrets became a recurring theme in American horror literature and film. Perhaps most chilling were the questions that remained unanswered. Had the Benders killed before arriving in Kansas? Were there other victims buried on the property that were never found? And what about the reports of missing travelers in other areas where the Benders might have fled? The true extent of their crimes may never be known. The legacy of the Bender family continues to fascinate true crime enthusiasts and historians alike. Their story represents a dark chapter in frontier history, revealing how the vast openness of the American West, which represented opportunity and freedom for so many, could also provide the perfect cover for those with murderous intentions. Today, the site of the Bender farm is marked only by a simple sign, easy to miss among the waving prairie grass. The apple orchard is long gone, the cabin destroyed by souvenir hunters. Yet the story of the bloody Benders lives on, a reminder of a time when the promise of frontier hospitality could mask the darkest of human intentions, and when justice, despite the best efforts of lawmen and vigilantes alike, could remain forever elusive.